The setting sun cast long shadows through the skeletal remains of New Haven Colony, painting the ruins in shades of amber and rust. Lyra pressed her small frame against a crumbling wall, all four of her arms wrapped tightly around her empty stomach. Her iridescent scales, once brilliant with the colors of dawn, had dulled to a sickly gray. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. The young Sylphian child peered around the corner, her large, multifaceted eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the whisper of toxic dust carried on the evening breeze. She'd learned early on that silence didn't mean safety. It often meant quite the opposite. A distant explosion made her flinch. The militia was getting closer, methodically sweeping through the residential sectors, claiming supplies from anyone too weak to resist. Lyra had watched them take everything from her neighbors, had seen the proud Sylphian elders bow their heads in defeat. Her own family had scattered during the first waves of violence, leaving her to fend for herself in the chaos. Something clattered nearby, the sound of boots on broken concrete. Lyra held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the shadows. The footsteps were uneven, accompanied by labored breathing and occasional muttered words in a language she didn't recognize. Then she caught a glimpse of the stranger through a gap in the wall. He was human, dressed in the tattered remains of what must have been a military uniform. Blood stained his left side, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone fighting through pain. What caught Lyra's attention wasn't his obvious injury, but rather the small pack he carried. The sight of it made her stomach clench with desperate hope. The human soldier, Sergeant Marcus Hayes, though Lyra wouldn't learn his name until later, slumped against a wall not far from her hiding spot. He pulled out a battered canteen, taking a careful sip before closing his eyes. Lyra watched him, torn between fear and desperate need. A sudden burst of gunfire in the distance made them both jump. The human's eyes snapped open, scanning the area, and landed directly on Lyra's hiding spot. She tried to shrink back, but a loose piece of rubble shifted under one of her feet, betraying her position. "Hey," the human called softly, his voice rough but gentle. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." Lyra trembled, caught between flight and the growing pain in her stomach. The human slowly reached into his pack and pulled out something wrapped in silver foil. The smell that wafted from it made her dizzy with hunger. "You must be starving," he said, carefully unwrapping what appeared to be some kind of protein bar. "When's the last time you ate?" Lyra didn't understand his words, but she understood the gesture when he broke the bar in half and held it out to her. Her people had warned her about humans, called them invaders, destroyers, but none of those stories matched the kindness in this stranger's eyes. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. The human remained perfectly still, arm extended, letting her approach at her own pace. When she was close enough to take the offered food, she noticed the way his hands shook slightly, how pale his skin had become. He was hurt worse than she'd initially thought. Lyra took the food and quickly retreated a few steps, but didn't run. She watched as the human ate his own half of the bar with measured bites, clearly trying to make it last. Something about his careful rationing touched her deeply. He was clearly hungry himself, yet he'd shared without hesitation. After finishing her portion, Lyra made a decision. She stepped forward again and pointed to the human's wounded side, then made a gesture her people used to offer help. The human's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with understanding. "That bad, huh?" He tried to shift position and winced. "Don't suppose you know somewhere safe to hole up? Can't stay in the open much longer." Lyra didn't need to understand his words to know what he was asking. She extended one hand, her upper right, the traditional greeting of her people, and waited. After a moment, the human reached out and gently took it. Together, they made their way through the ruins, the unlikely pair supporting each other as the last light faded from the sky. Lyra led them to a hidden basement she'd discovered weeks ago, accessible only through a narrow gap in the foundation that most adults would overlook. As she helped the wounded soldier settle against a wall, Lyra realized something had changed. For the first time since the violence began, she didn't feel quite so alone. The human had shared his food without knowing anything about her, had trusted her despite their differences. In return, she would help him survive the night. Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple exchange, food for shelter, trust for trust, would spark a chain of events that would change not just their lives, but the fate of an entire world. For now, though, they were simply two souls finding light in the darkness, proving that compassion could survive even in the harshest of circumstances. The night grew deeper, and somewhere above them, the war raged on. But in their small sanctuary, a wounded human soldier and a lonely alien child had found something precious, hope. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. Dawn broke over New Haven Colony, seeping through the cracks of Lyra and Marcus's underground shelter. The human soldier's condition had worsened overnight, his skin burning with fever. Lyra pressed her cool, scaled hands against his forehead, trying to ease his discomfort, but she knew they needed help, and soon. The sound of boots overhead made her freeze. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. A voice called out orders in the harsh tones of the militia. Search every building. Commander Thura wants this sector cleared by nightfall. Marcus stirred, his military training bringing him instantly alert despite his fever. He grabbed Lyra's hand and squeezed it gently, then pressed a finger to his lips. They waited in tense silence as dust filtered down from the ceiling, footsteps passing directly overhead. A new voice joined the others, this one feminine and authoritative. This is a waste of time, Commander. These ruins are dead. The drone scan showed heat signatures, Dr. Patel. Someone's hiding here. Lyra felt Marcus stiffen at the mention of drones. He pulled out a small device from his pocket, some kind of scanner, and studied it intently. After a moment, his eyes widened with recognition. He looked at Lyra and mind walking, then pointed upward. She shook her head frantically, but he gave her a reassuring smile. Before she could stop him, Marcus called out in a hoarse voice, Dr. Patel? Nadine Patel. The footsteps overhead stopped. There was a long pause, then, who's down there? Sergeant Marcus Hayes, 42nd Reconnaissance. I've got a civilian with me, and I'm wounded. Don't shoot. Another pause. Hayes? From the Jakarta mission? The same. Think you could convince Commander Thura not to kill us? Lyra trembled as voices argued overhead. She didn't understand the words, but she could hear the tension in them. Marcus kept hold of her hand, his grip steady despite his fever. Finally, the commanding voice spoke again. Dr. Patel vouches for you, soldier. Come out slowly. Marcus whispered to Lyra, it's okay. Dr. Patel is one of ours, a medical officer. She can help. He pointed to his wound, then to her, making sure she understood. Lyra nodded hesitantly. They emerged from their hiding place into the harsh morning light. Commander Thura stood with her militia squad, weapons raised. She was tall for a Sylphian, her scales a deep crimson, all four arms bearing the ceremonial markings of a war chief. But it was the human woman beside her that drew Lyra's attention. Dr. Nadine Patel stepped forward, her dark eyes quickly assessing Marcus's condition. You look terrible, Hayes. She started to move toward them, but Commander Thura blocked her path with one arm. The child stays here, Thura declared in heavily accented standard. She belongs with her own kind. Marcus straightened despite his pain. She stays with me. That's non-negotiable. Thura's scales flickered with anger. You don't make demands here, human. This is our world. Your world. Dr. Patel turned on Thura, her voice sharp. Look around you, Commander. Your pure Sylphian ideology has turned this colony into a graveyard. That child is starving, and your people did nothing to help her. We protect our own, Thura growled. No, Lyra spoke for the first time, her voice small but clear in the tense silence. She spoke in Sylphian, her words making Thura's scales pale. You protected yourself. He protected me. Dr. Patel took advantage of the commander's surprise, stepping forward to examine Marcus's wound. This is infected. He needs immediate treatment. She looked at Thura. You can either help us or shoot us, but decide quickly. I won't watch him die while you debate politics. Something shifted in Thura's expression, not quite softening, but changing. She studied Lyra for a long moment, then holstered her weapon. The medical bay at the central compound. We'll take them there. Both of them, Dr. Patel insisted. Thura nodded curtly. Both. But they're your responsibility. As they made their way through the ruins, Lyra noticed something strange. The militia soldiers were looking at her differently now, not with the usual contempt, but with something like shame. She realized that her words to Thura had struck deeper than she'd known. Sometimes the truth was most powerful when spoken by a child. The central compound turned out to be an old research facility, partially restored by Thura's forces. As Dr. Patel worked to save Marcus's life, Lyra refused to leave his side. She watched in fascination as human medicine and Sylphian healing techniques worked in concert. Dr. Patel's antiseptics and antibiotics combining with traditional poultices that Thura herself provided. Hours later, with Marcus stabilized and resting, Dr. Patel found Lyra curled up in a chair beside his bed. She draped a blanket over the exhausted child, then turned to find Thura watching from the doorway. "You were right," the commander said quietly. "We lost our way. It's not too late to find it again," Dr. Patel replied. "That's what humans do best. We help each other remember who we're supposed to be." Thura's scale shifted to a deeper hue, a sign of deep thought among her people. Perhaps there is wisdom in that. She looked at Lyra, then at Marcus. They will need protection when they leave here. The other militant factions won't be as understanding. Are you offering? I'm considering it. Thura's upper arms crossed in their traditional gesture of commitment. There's a network of survivors in the underground tunnels. Humans and Sylphians working together. I've been hunting them, but maybe it's time to help them instead. Dr. Patel smiled. Sometimes the strongest chains are the ones we choose to break. As night fell over the compound, Lyra dozed fitfully, her small hand still holding Marcus's. She didn't fully understand the changes happening around her, but she could feel them, like the first warm breeze after a long winter. Her act of trust in helping a wounded stranger had sparked something larger, something that was spreading even through the hardened hearts of Thura's militia. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, in this quiet room where human and Sylphian medicines worked together to heal, hope was taking root. And like all the strongest things in nature, it started small, with a simple choice between fear and compassion. The descent into New Haven's underground tunnels felt like entering another world. Lyra stayed close to Marcus as they followed their guide, a tall, lean figure who moved with the silent grace of someone who'd spent years in the darkness. He called himself Rook, and his skin was a patchwork of bioluminescent markings that pulsed softly in the dim light. "Watch your step," Rook warned, his voice barely above a whisper. The militia collapsed some of these passages during their raids. The safe paths changed daily. Commander Thura and Dr. Patel had arranged their escort to the resistance network, but only after extracting promises of silence about their involvement. The commander's change of heart was still fragile, and they all knew how dangerous knowledge could be in the wrong hands. Marcus was still weak from his injury, but the stubborn set of his jaw told Lyra he wouldn't complain. She'd learned to read his expressions well over the past few days, just as he'd learned to interpret the subtle color changes in her scales that betrayed her emotions. "The professor is eager to meet you both," Rook mentioned as they navigated a particularly narrow passage. "Word of what happened at the compound has already spread through our network. You've given people hope." "Hope can be dangerous," Marcus replied softly. Rook's bioluminescent patterns flickered in what might have been amusement. So can its absence. They emerged into a vast chamber that took Lyra's breath away. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet overhead, its surface dotted with clusters of glowing crystals that mimicked stars. Below, a makeshift city had sprung up in the cavern's embrace. Homes had been carved into the walls, connected by rope bridges and narrow walkways. Gardens of luminous fungi provided both food and light, while channels of underground water had been carefully directed to create a sustainable ecosystem. But what truly amazed Lyra was the population. Humans and Sylphians worked side by side, without tension or segregation. Children of both species played together near a teaching area where an elderly human woman was conducting a lesson. The air hummed with conversations in multiple languages, punctuated by laughter and song. "Welcome to Haven Below," a voice called out. A distinguished-looking human man approached them, his silver hair tied back in a neat queue. "I'm Professor June Park. We've been expecting you." Lyra instinctively moved closer to Marcus, but the professor's kind eyes and gentle smile put her at ease. He knelt down to her level, showing proper respect for a young Sylphian. "You must be Lyra," he said in perfect Sylphian. "Your courage has become quite the story among our people, both human and Sylphian." "I didn't do anything brave," Lyra replied shyly. "I was just hungry, and he was kind." "Sometimes the bravest acts are the simplest ones," Professor Park said. "Like trusting a stranger when everyone tells you not to." He stood and extended his hand to Marcus. "Sergeant Hayes, Dr. Patel sent word about your condition. Our medical team would like to examine you, ensure you're healing properly." Marcus nodded gratefully. The tunnels were a rough journey. "Rook, would you show them to the medical bay?" Professor Park asked. "And perhaps afterward, give young Lyra a tour of our learning center? I believe she might enjoy meeting some of our other children." As Rook led them through the underground city, Lyra noticed something odd about the professor's accent. "He speaks Sylphian like an elder," she whispered to Marcus. "That's because I learned from them," Professor Park called back, his hearing apparently sharper than she'd assumed. Before the war, I was a xenolinguist at the colony's university. I believed then, as I believe now, that understanding each other's languages is the first step to understanding each other's hearts. They passed a group of engineers, human and Sylphian, working together, who were installing new hydroponic systems. One of them waved to Professor Park with both sets of arms, a gesture that would have been unthinkable on the surface. "How do you make it work?" Marcus asked, watching the easy cooperation around them. "Up there, everything's broken along species lines. We remember what matters," Professor Park replied simply. "When you're fighting to survive in the dark, prejudice becomes a luxury you can't afford. Down here, you either learn to trust each other or you die alone." They reached the medical bay, where a team of doctors waited. Before Marcus went in for his examination, Lyra hugged him tightly. "You'll stay close. Always, little one," he promised. "Go explore with Rook. I'll find you when I'm done." Rook's tour revealed wonders Lyra had never imagined. The learning center was filled with books salvaged from the surface, along with hand-drawn star charts and botanical guides. Children gathered around interactive displays that taught both human and Sylphian languages. In one corner, a young human girl was teaching a Sylphian boy to play chess, while he showed her the intricate finger patterns of his people's traditional storytelling. "This is what we're fighting to protect," Rook explained as they watched the children play. "Not territory or resources, but this, the simple truth that we're stronger together than apart." Later that evening, as the crystal light dimmed to simulate night, Lyra sat with Marcus in their assigned quarters. The room was small but comfortable, with bioluminescent murals decorating the walls. "What happens now?" she asked, her scales shifting with uncertainty. Marcus touched her hand gently. "Now we help build something better. Professor Park says there are other settlements like this one, all connected through the tunnel network. They're creating a new kind of society down here, one that could eventually reshape what's happening on the surface. Because of us?" "Because of you," he corrected softly. "You showed everyone that trust is possible. Sometimes that's all people need. One example to light the way." As Lyra drifted off to sleep that night, lulled by the distant sound of water flowing through the cavern's ancient channels, she dreamed of a future where the barriers between species existed only in history books. In Haven Below, that future didn't seem so impossible anymore. But even as hope flourished in the underground sanctuary, dangers were stirring on the surface. Other factions had noticed Commander Thora's sudden change in behavior, and they were asking questions. The path ahead would not be easy, but then, nothing worth building ever was. The warning came at midnight. Vex, a former militia scout with mottled gray scales, burst into Professor Park's command center, breathing hard. "They're coming." The Purifiers found out about Commander Thora's defection. They're mobilizing for a full assault on the surface settlements. Lieutenant Zara Wright, newly arrived from the Human Relief Forces, studied the tactical display with narrowed eyes. The underground sensors showed massive troop movements converging on New Haven's ruins. "How long?" "Hours, at most," Vex replied, all four hands moving in agitated patterns. "They're led by General Krill. He makes Thora look gentle in comparison. He'll burn everything to flush out the collaborators." Professor Park's usual calm demeanor cracked slightly. "How many people are still up there?" "Too many," Marcus answered from the doorway. He'd insisted on joining the emergency meeting despite Dr. Patel's protests about his recovery. "The outer settlements, the neutral zones, there are hundreds who haven't made it to the tunnels yet." Lyra stood beside him, her scales shifting between fear and determination. She'd refused to stay behind when she heard the news, knowing too well what the Purifiers did to those they caught. "We have to help them." Lieutenant Wright nodded sharply. "Agreed. But we'll need a distraction to buy time for an evacuation." She turned to Vex. "You know their tactics. What would throw them off balance?" The former scout's bioluminescent patterns pulsed thoughtfully. Krill's forces rely on their targeting systems, advanced tech they stole from the colony's military base. If we could disrupt their sensors. "The resonance crystals," Rook interrupted, emerging from the shadows where he'd been silently observing. "The same ones that light our caverns. At the right frequency, they interfere with electromagnetic signals." Professor Park's eyes lit up. "The mining tunnels under the old industrial sector are full of them. If we could trigger a large enough resonance, we'd blind their targeting systems," Wright finished. "But someone would need to get up there and plant the charges, right in the middle of their advance." Marcus straightened. "I'll go." "Not alone," Vex said firmly. "I know those tunnels, and you're still recovering. I'll guide you." Lieutenant Wright began issuing orders, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to impossible missions. We'll split into teams. Vex and Hayes handle the resonance crystals. I'll lead the main evacuation force. We'll need both human and Sylphian fighters to convince people it's safe to trust us. I'm coming too, Lyra declared. Before anyone could protest, she continued. There are children up there, like I was. They'll be scared. They need to see that humans and Sylphians really can work together. Professor Parks studied her for a long moment, then nodded. She's right. Symbols matter, especially now. He turned to Dr. Patel, who had just arrived. Get the medical bay ready. We'll have wounded. As they prepared for the mission, Lyra helped Marcus check his equipment. She'd learned enough standard to understand the basics of what they were planning, and enough about war to be terrified for him. Promise you'll come back? He knelt down to her level, the way he had when they first met. I promise to try. But you have to promise me something too. Stay close to Lieutenant Wright. Help those kids, but don't take unnecessary risks. Deal. Lyra pressed her forehead to his, a gesture of deep trust among her people. Deal. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. While Marcus and Vex disappeared into the mining tunnels, Lieutenant Wright's team moved through the surface ruins like ghosts. They found frightened families hiding in basements, lone survivors in abandoned buildings, and even a group of militia deserters who had chosen conscience over loyalty to the purifiers. Lyra proved invaluable, just as she'd predicted. Her presence convinced hesitant Sylphian parents that the evacuation force could be trusted, while the sight of her working seamlessly with humans gave others hope. She stayed close to Lieutenant Wright, translating when needed and helping to calm panicked children. The first explosion caught everyone by surprise. The ground shook as resonance crystals deep underground began to vibrate, sending waves of electromagnetic interference through the air. Above them, purifier dropships began to wobble and veer off course, their targeting systems scrambled. That's our signal, Wright shouted. Everyone move. Head for the tunnel entrance in Sector 7. They had evacuated nearly 300 people when the second wave of explosions hit. These weren't planned. The purifiers had started bombing indiscriminately, trying to compensate for their lost precision. Buildings crumbled around them as they rushed the last groups to safety. Lyra's scales turned pale with fear as she realized Marcus and Vex hadn't returned. Lieutenant Wright grabbed her shoulder gently. They'll make it. They know the rendezvous point. As if summoned by her words, two figures emerged from a collapsing doorway. Vex was supporting Marcus, who seemed barely conscious, but they were alive. Dr. Patel rushed forward with a medical team as soon as they reached the tunnel entrance. Did it work? Marcus asked weakly. See for yourself, Wright replied, pointing upward through a gap in the ruins. The purifier forces were in chaos, their carefully planned assault deteriorating into confusion as their technology failed them. In the distance, more explosions indicated that the resonance effect was spreading through the crystal deposits beneath the city. Professor Parks' voice crackled over their communicators. The last groups are in. Seal the tunnels. As they descended into the safety of Haven below, Lyra held Marcus's hand tightly. She could feel the subtle tremors still running through the ground above, but they grew fainter with each step. Behind them, the surface world burned, but they had saved hundreds who would have burned with it. Later, in the medical bay, Lyra curled up in her usual chair beside Marcus's bed. Lieutenant Wright stopped by to check on them, her uniform still dusty from the evacuation. You did well today, she told Lyra. Both of you. The purifiers thought they could keep our peoples divided through fear. Instead, they gave us a reason to prove how strong we are together. Lyra watched the steady rise and fall of Marcus's chest as he slept, healing once again. What happens now? Wright's expression was grim but determined. Now we prepare. The purifiers will be back, and next time they'll be ready for our tricks. But so will we. She smiled slightly. Get some rest, little one. Tomorrow, we start training everyone who wants to learn to fight, not just with weapons, but with hope. In her dreams that night, Lyra saw the surface world as it could be, not burning, but blooming. She dreamed of cities where light and shadow danced together, where trust flowed as freely as the underground rivers of Haven below. The path to that future would be dangerous, but she was no longer the frightened child hiding in the ruins. She was part of something larger now, something that had started with a simple act of kindness and grown into a movement that could reshape their world. As dawn broke in the crystal caverns, Lyra knew that the real battle The fight for understanding was just beginning. 3 months after the Great Evacuation, Haven Below hummed with unprecedented activity. The underground sanctuary had transformed from a refuge into a fortress of hope. Its population nearly tripled. But it wasn't just numbers that had grown. Something else was blooming in the crystal-lit caverns, something that would soon change everything. Lyra stood at Professor Park's communication station, her scales shimmering with excitement as she helped monitor the incoming transmissions. Her command of both languages had made her an invaluable part of the Resistance's coordination team, despite her young age. Marcus watched from nearby, smiling at how much she'd grown in confidence. "Signal from the outer settlements," she called out. "Admiral Rhodes's fleet has entered the system." Lieutenant Wright straightened from where she'd been reviewing defense plans with Vex. "Right on schedule." "What about our surface allies?" "Commander Thoreau reports her forces are in position," Marcus confirmed. "The Purifiers still think she's loyal. They don't know she's been helping us evacuate the neutral zones for weeks." Professor Park nodded gravely. "Then it's time. Send the signal to Elder Siren." Lyra's hands trembled slightly as she transmitted the coded message. Elder Siren, the legendary leader of the Sylphian resistance cells in the Northern Territories, and unknown to most, Lyra's grandmother. They discovered the connection during the genetic database reconciliation just weeks ago, and the reunion had been tearful but brief. There was too much work to be done for personal indulgences. The response came almost immediately. "The seeds are planted. Let the harvest begin." Throughout Haven Below, people began moving with practiced precision. This was the moment they'd been preparing for since the evacuation, the culmination of countless small acts of trust and cooperation that had started with a wounded soldier sharing his food with a hungry child. Admiral Helena Rhodes's voice crackled through the command center speakers, crisp and authoritative. "This is the Earth Alliance humanitarian fleet to all surface forces. We are here under the authority of the Joint Species Council. Stand down and prepare for peaceful transition." On the tactical displays, dozens of ships appeared in high orbit, not just human vessels, but Sylphian ships as well. It was the first fruit of Elder Siren's work, convincing the Sylphian High Council that cooperation with humans wasn't just possible, but necessary for their species' survival. "They're not standing down," Vex reported, watching the Purifier Force's response. "General Krill is ordering his troops to battle stations." Professor Park smiled sadly. "As expected. Admiral, you may proceed with Phase 2. The next few hours were a testament to the power of unity. As the fleet engaged the Purifier's orbital defenses, Commander Thoreau's forces revealed their true allegiance, striking from within. Meanwhile, Elder Siren's resistance cells emerged from hiding across the Northern Territories, armed with weapons and supplies that had been smuggled through the underground network for months. But the real victory wasn't won with weapons. As the fighting raged above, Haven Below executed its masterstroke. Through thousands of hidden speakers planted throughout the surface ruins, they began broadcasting the truth, stories of cooperation and survival, testimonies from both humans and Sylphians who had found strength in unity. Most powerful of all were the voices of children like Lyra, speaking of hope instead of hate. The Purifier's troops, many of whom had been fed lies about human brutality and Sylphian purity, began to waver. When they saw Commander Thoreau fighting alongside humans, when they heard the voices of their own children speaking of a better way, the foundations of their hatred began to crack. "Movement in Sector 7, Lyra reported excitedly. 3 more Purifier units are requesting sanctuary. They're laying down their weapons." Marcus squeezed her shoulder gently. "Because of you, little one. You showed them it was possible." The fighting didn't end immediately. Hatred and fear never die easily. But by sunset, Admiral Rhodes and Elder Siren stood together in the ruins of New Haven's Central Plaza, signing the first draft of what would become known as the Unity Accords. Later that night, in a quiet moment between celebrations, Lyra found Marcus standing near one of Haven Below's underground waterfalls. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked in perfect standard. He laughed, "Remembering a very hungry day when I thought I was going to die alone in the ruins. Funny how sharing half a protein bar can change the world." "It wasn't the food," Lyra said softly. "It was the choice to share it. To see me as a child first, not an alien." Elder Siren approached them, her aged scales glowing with wisdom. "The greatest revolutions often start with the smallest acts of kindness," she said, embracing her granddaughter. "You two taught us that." Admiral Rhodes joined them, her formal uniform somewhat dusty from the day's activities. "The Real work begins tomorrow," she reminded them. Building is harder than fighting. But we'll do it together, Lyra declared firmly. The Admiral smiled. Yes, we will. The Joint Species Council has approved funding for a new settlement, one that will bridge the surface and the underground. Professor Park suggested we call it Haven United. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Above and below. Working as one? Like the rest of us, Vex called from nearby, where he was helping Lieutenant Wright coordinate supply distributions. No more divisions, no more hiding. As the celebration continued around them, Lyra leaned against Marcus, watching humans and Sylphians dancing together under the crystal lights. Children played games that mixed traditions from both cultures, while engineers from both species already worked on plans for the new settlement. We did it, she whispered. Marcus shook his head. No, little one. We just got it started. Look around. Every person here has their own story of choosing trust over fear, of reaching across the divide. That's how real change happens, not in one grand gesture, but in thousands of small choices. Elder Siren nodded approvingly. And those choices ripple outward, touching lives we'll never know about. The seeds you planted will grow for generations. As if to emphasize her words, a group of children ran past, human and Sylphian together, their laughter echoing through the caverns. They were growing up in a world where cooperation was normal, where the barriers between species were already beginning to fade. Above them, the first stars were becoming visible through Haven Below's crystal ceiling. Soon, those stars would guide ships carrying more refugees, more allies, more people choosing to believe in the power of unity. The war wasn't over everywhere, but something unstoppable had begun in the ruins of New Haven. It had started with a soldier's kindness and a child's trust. It had grown through the courage of people like Commander Thora, who chose to change rather than remain trapped in hatred. It had flourished in the wisdom of leaders like Professor Park and Elder Siren, who never stopped believing in the possibility of harmony. Now, as Lyra watched her two worlds merge into one, she understood what Marcus had meant about small choices. Every act of compassion was a seed, and together they had planted a forest of hope, one that would grow strong enough to weather any storm. The future was uncertain, but they would face it together, guided by the simple truth that had started everything. Sometimes the strongest bonds are forged by the smallest acts of kindness.